Hello. So this is going to be a history video, and my history videos are always inevitably a little bit longer because there is a lot to cover. Before I get into the main video, just a few disclaimers I want to make in advance. If I mispronounce anything in this video, apologies for that in advance. Um, Though I've looked at various sources on pronunciation, so the way I'm saying, for example, tribal names and so on is just the way I've heard them. Um, Also, this is in no way meant to be a very, very comprehensive video. There's absolutely no way I could discuss everything I would like to discuss without the video really going into big overtime. And, I am aware that anything over 20 minutes starts to get. I mean, to be honest, I know I'm lucky if I get anyone retaining that amount of viewership. So I'm bearing those things in mind. Nevertheless, I can't make this too fast because there is a lot to cover. I want to talk about the American West, um, but actually broader themes of North America, colonization in North America, and interaction between white Europeans and Native Americans. This is obviously a very controversial subject, but also a very interesting subject. And it's something that spans several centuries. So, kind of the context in which I'm talking is a documentary I've been watching, simply entitled The West, also known as Ken Burns Presents The West. Ken Burns is famous for his award-winning documentary, The Civil War, which I think, in my view, is one of the best documentaries ever made, very comprehensive. This is a bit later, this is from 1996, but again, very in-depth, a lot of homework done. It's basically 8 episodes, about 12 hours total, so really in-depth. Produced by Ken Burns, directed by Stephen Ives, and narrated by Peter Coyote. Uh, don't know his name pronunciation there, but it's a very interesting documentary, and in true Ken Burns style, it really does show every side of the equation. Um, if we look online at the general idea of Europeans in North America, it generally goes along the lines of basically the wicked white man came in and killed all the Indians, and that was it. People tend to have a very black and white view of post-Columbian history in North America, and also a very black and white view of pre-Columbian history. Now, what's interesting is early in this documentary, which obviously focuses on the West, I'm going to be expanding this out a little bit more, but the documentary, early on, there is a Native American historian, and what she actually says is that sometimes it's misguided to assume that before Columbus, before the Europeans arrived, it was all bliss and harmony, and there was all this kind of intertribal harmony, and everyone got on with each other and were at one with nature. I think that's a very, in some ways, naive view of the situation. Certainly, there were things that happened with European arrival that drastically, dramatically, and forever changed the cultural landscape of North America. And I'm focusing on North America for this. Obviously, there was a whole situation in South America as well, but for concise reasons, we'll go focus on North America. First, of course, were the Spanish, and then other groups came. There were, of course, the Pilgrim Fathers from England. Now, one thing that I've never really liked is when people simplify history. History is very, very rarely simple. Very rarely simple. That's not to say that there haven't been great injustices in history, because there have. But I think it's very important to realize that this was a time when there was a great deal of, yes, there was exploitation, there was greed, and there was also misunderstandings. Now, from the outset, it has to be remembered that the native people of North America, and incidentally, I don't mind saying Native Americans. I don't think that's politically correct. I think it's just an accurate terminology. It's important to realize the history of them themselves. Um, Human habitation of North America, and there's obviously anthropological debate on this, but we could say modern humans arrived in North America sometime after the last ice age, about 10 to 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. The exact period is debated. There is a theory, which I find very intriguing actually, that the first North Americans were Asiatic. That is to say, they had come from what is now present day China and Mongolia. This is an interesting theory because if you look at certain ethnic groups in China, especially, for example, Mongolians, there is a remarkable visual similarity between people from that part of the world and certain Native American tribal groups. And so I don't think it's far fetched to think that there may have been something in that, in the genetic history of the makeup of these people. Now, this is very important because one of the main arguments about this is who owns the land and who was there first and so on. Of course, these people were there long before Europeans, millenniums before Europeans. But one very important thing to recognize is that there was enormous diversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity within Native Americans themselves, pre-Columbian. Today there are 567 recognized tribal groups as of 2017, and there are others that so far haven't been recognized, but 567 groups. Enormous cultural variation, linguistic variation, um, dress variation. I mean, the difference between, let's say, the Hopi people of Arizona and, I don't know, the Creek Indians of Alabama is probably as diverse as the difference between a Briton and a Russian. So that, I think, is a very important point to remember because the very naive, almost childlike notion of the West and of North America in general is this kind of cowboys and Indians thing. And I think, to be fair, a lot of the older films are partly to blame for that because some of them were a little bit. I actually think modern westerns are a bit weightier in terms of the way they treat history. Some of the old westerns do tend to be a bit black and white in the way they present things. I'm not saying all of them, but you know there are some classics like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and so on. But that is generally the stereotype of the West: cowboys and Indians, goodies and baddies. Of course, it's not that simple. Um, Before I made this video, I came across a video by Stefan Molyneux, who is a right-wing YouTuber. He makes a lot of videos about a lot of subjects, and I don't agree with everything he says, but one thing I do respect about Stefan Molyneux is he genuinely seems to spend a lot of time doing his research. Because when he presents videos, and they tend to be quite lengthy, usually between half an hour and in some cases up to 3 hours, he really lays out the case with a lot of like bullet points. He never rants and raves, which I find some a bit off-putting about some right-wing people. Um, you know, I think he's a very skilled, um, debater is the wrong word, but very skilled speaker in terms of the points he puts across. I think he is biased. I think he does show one side, but he is very good at doing what he does, at being persuasive in his arguments. Anyway, one of the things he laid out in this video about Native Americans was about genealogy and about this very contentious notion of genocide. And what he went on to talk about is the numbers that were believed to be there pre-European settlement, the numbers today, what the genetic makeup of modern Americans are. Apparently, according to his video, something like 0.18% of the DNA of modern white Americans is Native American, which indicates obviously mixed marriages and so on. You can find similar examples in history. For example, the Romano-British in Britain, who were half British and half Roman. Um, so this is true throughout history. You can see it all over the world. Genocide is obviously a very, very loaded term, and it comes with it a specific meaning of wiping out an entire race of people. Now, I don't entirely agree with his assertion that there's no genocide. I do believe that there were acts that, firstly, are inexcusable, and secondly, were attempts to wipe out entire cultures. So, in that sense, they were, if not successful genocide, certainly attempts at genocide. One of the most glaring was the so-called Trail of Tears. Um, because what happened with that, with the Indian resettlement under Andrew Jackson, was appalling. There's no rational way anyone can make any excuses for that. Um, I think really it's very important to look at this diversity, though, within the Native American population, because one of the naive ideas, and this is what the historian pointed out, is sort of excuse me for putting it this way, but the noble savage. This idea that it was this virtuous Indian versus the evil white man, it really was not that simple. There wasn't a tribal warfare before Europeans arrived, and there was cruelty, and there was exploitation. I think it's easy to forget that because, let's say, the white man was militarily the most successful, the United States Army was simply overwhelming in its force and its ruthlessness. Because they were the winners in a sense, it's easy to think of them as being the only party that was guilty of any atrocity or any wrongdoing. Now, there were examples of Native American groups killing unarmed civilians among settlers. Of course, there were examples on the other side as well of settlers killing unarmed Indians. The point I'm making is it did work both ways. And it's interesting to think that among the early settlers, I'm talking about the 13 colonies, there was a group of Native American tribes called the so-called Five Civilized Tribes. And I believe they were the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee or the Creek Indians, and the Seminole. Now, they were described as civilized because they actually adopted and assimilated with a lot of the European customs. Another custom they assimilated to was slavery. And that's the interesting thing. Some of the early Native American groups absolutely endorsed slavery. They benefited from slavery just as much as the white man. So issues like this shouldn't really be overlooked. In fact, in the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma in 1842, there was a slave uprising, an African slave uprising. So to present Native Americans as being entirely virtuous and entirely guilt-free is a little bit short-sighted. There was also intertribal warfare. One interesting period was the California Gold Rush. In fact, the episode I've just watched in the West documentary was specifically focusing on that. Around 1848, 1849, gold was discovered in Death Valley, and that produced this mass intake of people from all over the world, in fact. Europeans, American citizens, Mexicans, Chinese. In the end, it was the Americans who were the most ruthless and the most, in some ways, the most greedy. But all of those groups wanted the same thing. They all were motivated by getting the gold. There is no question about it. That is, again, one of the most glaring examples of that clash of civilizations, in a sense, if I could put it that way, being predominantly bad for the Native American population. For example, according to the documentary, there were 150,000 Indians in the area before this, and that dwindled down to 30,000 afterwards. So that's a glaring example of the sort of demographic change that this had. Another major issue was this issue of European diseases being brought in. Now, I think this is a very important area because one of the sort of internet stereotypes of this period of history, well, I talk about this period, but really, it's a long period we're talking about, anything from 1520 to 1900. if we take the entire scope of European contact with North America. Um, the general idea is the white man came in and killed every Indian in sight. Now, from a practical point of view, this makes no sense. This really makes no sense. It's easy to forget that those early settlers were refugees fleeing religious persecution in England, in Germany, and in other parts of Europe. I mean, in the 17th century, Britain had went through a very bloody period of turmoil known as the War of the Free Kingdoms, or the Wars of the Free Kingdoms. And that was largely, religion was a major aspect of that. So this kind of stereotype of like the rich white man coming in, firstly, they were not rich. They were refugees. They went to America for a better life. And they went in, and when they expanded westward, they faced enormous challenges, enormous hardship, killer diseases, sometimes violent interactions with Native American groups. And like I say, it worked both ways. They were also guilty of, very often there was misunderstandings. It could be a misunderstanding in the language. It could be a misunderstanding in the trading negotiation. But it makes no sense when you think about it that a refugee group would come in and want to wipe out the native population in that sense. Because they needed the native population for trading, for knowing the land. One famous example is the Lewis and Clark expedition. They use, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Saskatchewan, the Native American girl who accompanied Lewis and Clark. They needed her because as a Native American, she knew the land. She was their navigator. So it really isn't as simple as constant warfare between white Europeans and Native Americans. Very often, it would be wrong to say it was all harmony, but very often they relied on one another. And there are examples throughout history of confederations and allegiances. During the French and Indian War, which was the North American name for the 7 Years' War, the Native American groups along what is now New England, New York, Pennsylvania, they had their allegiances, whether it was to the British or the French. During the American Revolutionary War, the Iroquois Confederacy were loyal to the Crown, and they actively supported logistically the British Army. So it really isn't as simple as the white man versus the Native American. And like I say, there was intertribal warfare. I mean, at the same time as the California Gold Rush and into the 19th century, the Lakota people, known to their enemies as the Sioux, were well known for being ruthless. And they were well known for keeping other tribal groups hostage and keeping them in subjugation. The Shawnee were one of the groups that were mortal enemies of the Dakota. So the Dakota concept of expansionism was really not that different from the American concept of expansionism, manifest destiny. And had the Dakota people, just as an example, had the manpower, had the industrial prowess and so on, it could well be that what is now the United States might have ended up as a Lakota Republic. Who knows? I'm just throwing that out there. That might be a completely naive hypothesis, but I'm just putting it out there that that is an example of the fact that, notwithstanding the language differences and so on, some of the basic human nature was there. Native Americans are human beings like anyone else, you know, and they had intertribal warfare, they had peace negotiations, each tribe was different, and some of them were greedy. So I say this not to be revisionist, but because it is the truth. And Native American historians will testify to that. They will say that it wasn't a case. I mean, when you think about it logically, 567 federally recognized groups. Is it really plausible that before Europeans arrived, they all got on with each other? Of course not. Of course not. I think that is incredibly naive. Now, I think the problem that people who really want to gloss over this period sometimes make is they do underplay some of the terrible things that were done by Europeans, especially the Spanish. I think the Spanish were far worse in some ways than the Germans and the English. I think that they were particularly ruthless. I mean, when the Spanish conquistadors came, it was basically you have 5 minutes to convert to the cross or you die. And that was the brutal history of the very early history, like 16th century. But by the time the Pilgrim Fathers came, and by the time we get into the mid 19th century, that really was about individual destiny of groups. For example, who what the, I mean, we look at the Church of Latter Day Saints. We look at the mission in what is now Oregon, which resulted in the infamous Whitman massacre. Now, that came about from a misunderstanding of what both sides wanted. In the case of the Whitman mission, they were somewhat arrogant in believing they could impose their religion. But the Native Americans in that region, I forget which group it was, but they, there was misunderstandings there, and in the end, they believed you cannot trust the white man, so they killed them. They killed unarmed people, and that's not to say it was right or wrong because it came from fear. It came from a fear these people are going to take over our land, but I think people need to be very careful about simplifying history when we're talking about Native Americans and Europeans. What I would say simply is this, well, not simply, but history is really not so simple. Now, there's no question about it. There was an overwhelmingly negative impact of European expansion in North America. It had a massive negative demographic change in terms of millions of people dying off over centuries from European diseases. But this is very different from genocide. It's important to remember that those early settlers had very basic medical knowledge. And the idea that there was a sort of germ warfare in the sense of the 20th century sense, I think is preposterous. It just doesn't make sense. So those who put out this idea that the Europeans went in and killed every Indian in sight, I think they're basing that on the fact that atrocities did occur. But I think it's misguided to present that as a whole picture because it wasn't the whole picture. And there is a long list of unforgivable things that Europeans done. Europeans slash Americans, as they then became. Um, there was Wounded Knee, there was the Trail of Tears, there was the cruelty and the atrocities around the California gold rush. There was, that was outright exploitation. Indians were legally basically slaves. Um, so I do think that more conservative people need to also not underplay this. I will close with a few points because I didn't want to make this excessively long. Um, Firstly, I'm very interested in Native American culture, and I think it's very important that as the original inhabitants of North America, their voice needs to be heard. So when it comes to contentious issues like the Dakota Pipeline, now I haven't followed that at great depth, but I do think it is very important that Native American voices are heard. It also has to be remembered that Native Americans, despite all the hardship and the cruelty that they went through, have given a lot back to the United States, the country. They've served in the military. One example is the Navajo Windtalkers during World War II. They have risen to prominent positions. I believe the most prominent Native American to serve in the American government was Curtis, Curtis Stevens. No, Curtis Stevens is a boxer. Excuse me. He was vice president under Calvin Coolidge. No, I forget his name now, but there were many examples of Native Americans. I'm just typing this in actually. because apologies for this, because I should have had this really prepared, but yeah, there are many examples of Native Americans, even up to today, serving in Charles Curtis. That's it, Charles Curtis, who served as vice president um, under Herbert Hoover. Eli Parker, who was in the cabinet of Indian Affairs in the Grant administration, and there's others. Um, so it's also important to recognize the vital role that Native Americans have played. I do hope one day to see a Native American president. I think that would be a wonderful thing. It is far fetched because the population today of pure Native Americans is estimated. I mean, people who self-identify as Native American is about between 3 and 5 million in a country of 300 million. So I think it's far more likely that there'll be a Hispanic president. But I think that would be a wonderful thing. Um, and it's just an interesting subject. All I would close on is that you can't present history as so simple. You can't say it's either white man versus Native Americans. Certainly that comes into it. In no way am I trying to underplay that, but I just wish people were a little bit more, spend a little bit more time looking into these things. There were unforgivable things done, the Trail of Tears, for example, and the way that Indians were exploited, the way that they were degraded, the way that their natural food was taken away. I mean, the decline, for example, in American bison between 1850 and 1900 was staggering. In 1900, it's estimated there may have been as little as 500 individual bison. That is now, the good news is that's once again on a resurgence. Today, the population's about 360,000. Still nothing like the pre-European level of about 60 million, but it is on a resurgence, and it's no longer, it's classed as little concern in the taxonomy records. So I'll leave it there. There has been a lot to cover here, but I'm very interested in Native American history. And interesting point, Pocahontas, of course, is one of the most famous Native Americans. She's had counties named after her and so on, Disney films. Apparently she's buried in Gravesend. I never realised that. Unfortunately, the grave is unmarked, but if I'm ever in Gravesend, I would love to check that out. There is in the church a little statue of Pocahontas, and there's a famous picture of her in early 16th, early 17th century European fashion. So that's interesting. But let me know your thoughts. If you are Native American, let me know what tribe, what nation you identify with, and feel free to share your thoughts. I hope this video hasn't been offensive to anyone. That isn't my purpose. Rather, it's just to say that, this was a time when everyone went through hardships, and there were certain common denominators in what people wanted in terms of grabbing land. There is a saying that all land at some point has been taken. I mean, you could argue that the Native Americans took the land from the natural environment. Some groups certainly were at one with nature, but others did exploit it as well. So I don't. I think it's actually patronising the Native Americans to treat them all as one and the same. To treat them all as kind of harmonious people doing the powtow and so on. It's not that simple. So apologies if I've got any terminology wrong in this video. I take full responsibility for that. But excuse me, I've got hiccups today. But it is a very interesting period, and yeah, let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.